All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Chase Allis, Professional Development and Outreach Specialist here at ACRL. Thank you for joining us for the ACRL Presents webcast, celebrating Open Access Week, building structural equity and inclusion in scholarly communications. Before we get started, I want to share a few notes and reminders. As my colleague Lois has said, today's session is being recorded, and we'll share the recording link shortly after the webcast concludes. It will also be available on our website and YouTube channel. Second, if you have questions during the event, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'll be collecting questions and we'll read them to the presenters at the end of their presentation. You can open the chat box by clicking the chat icon at the bottom of the screen. And finally, this free webcast and ACRL's other free professional development opportunities are made possible by your ACRL membership, which helps fund many of our programs and services for the academic and research library community. Not a member? Join nearly 10,000 of your colleagues and become a member today. Visit ala.org/ACRL/membership for more information. Today, we are excited to hear from recipients of ACRL's Scholarly Communications Research Grants, and I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for this session, Charlotte Rowe. Charlotte is the Scholarly Communications Librarian at the University of San Francisco and serves as the current chair of ACRL's Research and Scholarly Environment Committee. Thanks again for joining us, everybody. And Charlotte, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Thanks so much, Chase. Happy Open Access Week, everyone. Special thanks to Amanda Nichols-Hess, Erin Neves, Eloise Sharp, and Chase, and other ACRL folks for putting this all together, and also for shepherding all the research grants through this very difficult year. Thank you so much to the researchers for being really lovely and flexible. The research grants were an outcome of the open and equitable scholarly communications, creating a more inclusive future research agenda. And I'm actually going to drop the link to that in the chat. It says $40, but if you scroll to the very bottom, you'll see that there's also an open access edition. I personally requested that my library purchase a copy for our record, because this is only the second time that ACRL has put together a scholarly communications agenda. And the first time it was just a bunch of ScholComm experts in a room together. And this time the agenda was put together through interviews, focus groups, workshops, and online survey, and over 1,000 members of provided their thoughts and expertise to shape it. And it really recommends ways to make the scholarly communications and research environment more open, inclusive, and equitable. And those are social justice values are really at the core of the agenda. So each of these research grants were chosen with that mission in mind. And I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves because we have quite a few people, and I find that otherwise we tend to forget who's who. So Teresa and Elena, please take it away.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share the screen. And while I do that, my name is Teresa Schultz, and I am the Social Sciences Librarian at the University of Nevada, Reno.
And I'm Elena Ozabocht, and I'm the Health Sciences Librarian at the University of Nevada, Reno.
Okay, Elena, you want to get going?
Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. We're so happy to be here and to tell you about how we use the grant money to do a project that has two components. And our focus is on accessibility, specifically the accessibility of OERs. So if you're not familiar with the term accessibility, web accessibility specifically, it just means that web content and tools are designed in a way that makes them accessible to people with a wide range of disabilities. And that includes things like, auditory disabilities, like hearing, visual disabilities, also physical and cognitive disabilities. And it's mandated, web accessibility, by a couple different parts of the law. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And as part of this, a lot of institutions of higher ed are legally responsible for making educational content accessible so as not to discriminate against people with disabilities. And our institution, including many others, have had lawsuits brought against them because of this. And that's why we became interested, actually, is that our university had a lawsuit and we had a big accessibility push. So Teresa and I learned a lot about accessibility, and we started becoming more curious about OERs and open access materials. And a lot of people, oh, go ahead, Teresa.
I was also just going to add, for us, it's a really strong imperative. We really cannot provide books or other materials to our students if they are not accessible. So it's really a big imperative for us now.
Yeah, and we're using very high, like looking at the guidelines. So I have here so if you've ever heard of WCAG or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, they're from the World Wide Web Consortium. And a lot of people use these guidelines as a baseline for evaluating how accessible their content is. And we are using one of the higher levels and really digging into how accessible our materials are. And so we use the WCAG guidelines as our guiding point for what we're doing, but also there are a number of automated accessibility checkers out there. So SiteImprove is one I have listed. It's for evaluating a website, but a lot of things you have to end up doing manually to determine whether or not it's accessible. So our project, like I said earlier, has two components. So we did a survey of self-identified OER librarians, and Teresa's going to talk about that in a minute. And then we also use a lot of the grant money to hire a student to help us actually evaluate the accessibility of a randomly selected portion of open textbooks out there. I'm going to talk about that briefly for a second. So the textbook evaluation, we're still analyzing the results. We've done all the data collection. But we developed a rubric based on the WCAG guidelines. So there are 16 categories or criteria we looked at. And not all of the categories applied to everything we looked at because we had different formats. But we found 350 randomly selected textbooks, a little more than that actually. And we just evaluated the first 20 pages or so of each. And we use a variety of different tools and a lot of manual checking. And some of the things we were looking at were things like, were images provided with alt text, alternative text, so a screen reader could tell someone what was happening in the image. Were tables formatted correctly? Was everything coded so that you could tell what was a heading and what was not a heading? That sort of thing. And our final sample set ended up being 355 textbooks. And we had a variety of different formats. So HTML, so just like a website, PDFs, EPUBs, which is a type of like ebook format, and just Word docs. So we're still going through the results, but I can tell you that very, very, very few books actually hit all of the criteria. Most of them ran afoul of the WCAG guidelines in some way, usually more than one way. And so, like I said, there's about 16 categories we're looking at, and the average number of fails, as we called them, so where they ran afoul of that criteria point, was about 5.9, and the median was about 6. And so we're still digging into this because we want to know, how the different formats compare and if they failed in different ways, or if just everyone was having problems, say, with providing alt text and just all across the board. So look out for that sort of information about this project in the future. We're going to be presenting at the Open Ed conference in November, and hopefully we'll have everything ready. We should have everything ready for that.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the other part of the project, which was our survey of OER librarians. And so what we did, our methodology, was we created a 4-part survey. The first 2 parts was kind of more just what was their general OER work like, how much time do they spend on OERs, et cetera, things like that. And then we asked them about their general accessibility knowledge, and this included what type of accessibility training they've had. And then the bulk of the survey really focused on how do they incorporate, if at all, accessibility into their work with OERs. And then we finally had a short section on demographics. We tried to keep it fairly short overall. This was deemed we did submit it to our IRB, it was deemed exempt. We sent it out to 5 email list services, I believe 3 ACRL list services, the Scholarly Communication, the Instruction Librarians, and then I believe we did the community colleges section, just because we know they have a strong interest in OERs. And then we also sent it out to a Spark list service, as well as a Creative Commons list service that they have for OERs. The survey ran for a month from about April to May of this year. We were a little concerned because of COVID, but we did invite, it was basically anyone worldwide, so no geographical limitations, who identified as working with OERs in any component, no matter how little or small. And we did end up having 193 people who finished the survey. So they passed their screener questions, and they actually went through the whole thing, which we considered we were really happy with that response. Although I will say no question was ever required, so not all of our answers actually had 193 responses. And also I will say, so again, we did not limit it to geography, but the vast majority of our respondents were from the United States. So we don't really consider this to be like a worldwide representative sample. Okay, so results. And these are just some of the results, there's a lot. We asked them about what type of accessibility training they've had. And they were able to select multiple answers. And we were very happy to see that only 18 of them had said they had no accessibility training at all. So definitely, you know, it is something that people are aware of, and which we thought was good. But you'll also notice that the most common types of training, so webinar, 126 respondents had selected that one, followed by one-off workshops and conference sessions. Those tend to be shorter, more, you know, skin deep, not really in-depth types of training, which if you have started doing accessibility work, you know how complicated and, you know, it can be. It's not something that's really easy. And while, you know, those webinars and one-off workshops can be really great, it might be that, you know, people really need more than that. Okay, so we also asked them to rate how confident they were in their accessibility knowledge. And we did provide a definition of what we meant by each of these. So the most common one with 106 respondents, so a little more than half, was confident, which we defined as somewhat familiar with basics of accessibility tools and practices and apply them infrequently. So confident might not be necessarily what we always think of as confident. It's more, yes, we're aware, we do actually use these at least somewhat, but not like super confident. My apologies. Second was somewhat confident with 53 respondents. And for that one, we defined it as aware of accessibility tools and practices, but don't apply them. So there's no active application. And then third, we did have 23 respondents who said they were very confident, which we defined as familiar with accessibility tools and practices and apply them regularly. So that's really, that was good to see that. And then at the bottom there was not confident. So only 11 people said that they were not even aware of accessibility and tools and practices. Okay, then we asked them a couple questions about how are they actually, you know, like do they factor in accessibility? And the first one was, we asked them, when you're working with faculty to create, choose, and adapt OERs, do you consider accessibility? And we didn't really try to define what that means. Like, does consider mean, yeah, we're like just thinking about it, but then we don't really, you know, do anything with it? Or, you know, maybe they are actually. But we did have 47% of librarians who said, yes, they do all the time. And then we had another 43.5% who said that they sometimes consider accessibility when they work with faculty on OERs. So we were very happy to see that, you know, like only about 10% of the respondents said, no, they don't ever consider accessibility. But at the same time, we didn't ask them to qualify what is sometimes. So for all we know, that could have been 5% of the time, or it could have been 90% of the time. I don't know. But we really definitely want to see more librarians move to that all of the time, where they're at least considering accessibility, because, you know, that's a pretty low bar, just considering, not even are you making sure it's accessible. And then we asked them, you know, do you consider accessibility when adding OERs to your collection? Like if you're actually adding it to your online catalogs. And only 28% of librarians said they do that. Now, I don't think we actually asked them how many of them add OERs to their collection. So it could just be that a lot of them aren't doing that work. We also asked them, like, what types of accessibility services do they offer their patrons? And consultations definitely were the most popular, with about half, or 99 of our respondents. And then that was followed by sharing third-party resources with 94, and referring to non-library institutional personnel with 77. I will say one interesting thing to know about those top three: they tend to be more passive in nature. It's not really actively doing accessibility work. The most common active one that I would say is, you know, using software that Elena talked about to do auto checks of OER accessibility. Just 58 librarians said they're doing that. And that was followed by 53 who said they're doing actual manual checks of OER accessibility. And those auto tools are great, but for anyone who's used them, you know, you almost always have to do a manual check on top. Okay. We then asked them about their top challenges in doing OER accessibility work. And the 5 most common ones that were stated: inadequate staffing, 80% of our respondents said that one. And yeah, that one definitely seems like a big one. Lack of expertise, 76%. So again, that's kind of where training comes in. Difficulty addressing existing content with 69% of respondents. And by that, we mean OERs that are already out there and are not accessible and need remediation work. Lack of finances, 62%, and lack of institutional guidance, 62%. And then finally, we asked them about what are their most what are the most requested areas of support to make OERs accessible. And easy to use tools was definitely the most popular with 88%, which again, if you've used some of these tools, they are not super friendly. They take a while to learn. I would personally say Adobe Acrobat Pro, it's a great tool, but it's not easy to use. And that was followed again by a request for more in-depth training with 68%. Community support to troubleshoot issues was followed by 62%. And then just request for more funding, 57% of respondents. And then finally webinars at 50%. So there are 2 types of training up there. So definitely training is an issue we're seeing. So looking forward, when we were looking at the data, like Elaine and I were trying to think, like, what would we recommend? And ideally, we would love to see more OER librarians at least helping faculty evaluate their OERs for accessibility. We do understand that accessibility work, it's very intensive. It's not easy to do, especially if you're doing like remediation type of work. That can be hard. It's not, it's not something that all librarians can do, especially for those OER librarians who did make up a majority of our survey where they're only spending a small portion of their time on OERs. But we would love to see more librarians actually at least help evaluate, because that's a little bit less time intensive. We would love to see more OER incentive funds actually include accessibility as a requirement. We would also love to see professional groups such as ACRL and Spark provide some of that more in-depth accessibility training that I think clearly people want, and some of that community support. And then also, as people are creating and adapting OERs to make them more accessible, we would love to see those copies shared, especially with improved metadata to let people know that they are accessible. We would just like to thank the ACRL Research and Scholarly Environment Committee for the grant that supports this project. And we'll be saving questions, I know, until the end, but if you guys just think of something after the fact and you want to send us an email, here are emails. And we are happy to say that we have had an article on the survey portion of the project accepted by college and research libraries. I think it should be hopefully published sometime next year. All right, and that is all we have.
Thank you so much, Teresa. Next is Jennifer and Julia.
Everyone, happy Open Access Week. Julia will be sharing our slides, so you should be seeing them shortly. All right, thanks everyone.
Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started.
Awesome. So let's go on to the next slide. So our presentation for you is about score analysis. And as you can see here, we've got SCORE in all caps because it is an acronym for Scholarly Communication Outputs, Reviewership, and Editorship. I'm Jennifer Chan and the Scholarly Communication Librarian at UCLA. And I'm with my colleague, Julia Swanson, who's the Acquisitions Librarian at the University Libraries at the University of Colorado, Boulder. So first off, our thanks to RESEC and ACRL for their support of this project. We also would like to thank the Librarians Association of the University of California, specifically the Research and Professional Development Committee, also for their support of our research study. So a little bit more about us. As I mentioned, I am the Scholarly Communication Librarian at UCLA.
And I'm Julia Swanson from the University of Colorado Boulder and the Acquisitions Librarian. And we are sharing a little bit about our mutual interests in coming together on this project. And we both had some concerns about the scholarly communication process, knowledge production system. One of the first things was the uncompensated labor that faculty provide when publishing articles and peer reviewing and conducting editorial positions with publishers.
So we think that there's really a very large imbalance when it comes to the relationship for scholarly communication production of knowledge. We don't want to present a view of information as being commodified, but here, for practical purposes, we really are looking at these scholarly communication outputs as being primarily scholarly research articles. There are other outputs that we take into account, but that's the primary area of focus for us. So with that production process, with the submissions process, peer review process, and then editorship of these journals, a lot of that labor is, of course, largely uncompensated, although these are generally research faculty at R1 and other research institutions. And of course, in that capacity, they are being compensated by our institutions. So we really do also want to look at what we consider a loss of agency among scholars and libraries, in that they're kind of cogs in the process rather than really playing an active role in either advocating their production processes or other things related to the creation of these outputs. And so when we were talking about kind of our concerns, not just in terms of the rising cost of subscriptions, but also our concerns about being able to adequately support these research activities, we realized that there was really a lack of an existing framework for analysis. And so that's where our study really comes in. So to give a research overview, we really wanted to investigate these traditional modes of scholarly publishing, because we felt that they thrive on this model of uncompensated labor, really in the form of peer review, as well as what's often unpaid editorial work. There are some editors of certain prominent journals that may be receiving some sort of remuneration, but for the most part, much of this effort and labor is uncompensated. The other issue is there's largely a pay-to-read economic model. So we have here publications that are freely created, labor that's contributed to creating and publishing these articles, but then the institutions where these individuals actually work have to then pay again to get access to these contents. So our framework, scholarly communication outputs plus reviewership and editorship, really developed through looking at whether or not we can assess how institutions are contributing to this productive process, not really just only limited to the institutional engagement, but also in assessing how much contribution in terms of uncompensated labor or researcher activity is really going into the production of scholarly communication research. So our study is actually a records-based study. We did have to submit for IRB review at both the University of Colorado Boulder, where the records were created, as well as at the University of California, Los Angeles. We did manage to get an exemption for IRB because our research is based on records research. But we wanted to really take a look at these new sources of data, rather they're data that haven't been utilized in this way before. So we're looking at institutional data about faculty publication processes, as well as their self-reported data about their professional service. And so again, the service here we're looking at is them conducting peer review, as well as serving as journal editors. And we wanted to develop, or rather determine, the viability of looking at this type of data in this particular way. So quantitatively, we're looking at how many individuals are serving at the institution, what their roles are, what sort of research outputs are being created. And this is, of course, primarily looking at journals, but we're not limited to just counting the number of publications. The other interest of the framework is to really advance scholarly communication as a more equitable system, because we realize when we're looking at this, it's really not taking into account a lot of the research activity that's happening at institutions that don't fall into this sort of relatively narrow view of just the research article. But the reason that we're focusing on this particular output is because this is by far the vast majority of where effort is being expended both in terms of where the information is being created, as well as what libraries are having to support.
So to talk a little bit more about both the University of Colorado Boulder and the data set that we looked at, we chose the University of Colorado Boulder because of this knowledge about sort of the composition of the research that's going on there, as well as the data that is available. So CU Boulder, as it's known in short, is an R1 intensive, research intensive university. It does not have a med school with the Boulder campus. And so the data set itself doesn't include any of the faculty that might be doing research out of the medical school. And so that does change sort of the composition of the type of research that goes on in comparison to some other R1 schools, such as UCLA, which has a medical school attached. And then I think the most important thing is that there's this mature implementation of systematic data collection on faculty research activity. So what we have is what's known as the annual faculty reporting process, and it's a homegrown system that has been developed by the university. And I don't know how many years ago it was developed, but my guess is it's been in place for at least 10 years, probably longer, where as part of the annual performance evaluation process, so not tenure, not promotion activity, but just the annual merit review, faculty are required to fill out information about their activity in the past year, which includes research activity, service activity, and then teaching or similar librarianship type activity. And that is all collected at the campus level in a format that can be evaluated both at the unit level and at the campus level. And so because of this, we are able to see that there is data collection in the publications, in the peer review activity, and the editorial activity, some of these key areas that we really wanted to study. And then because it also happens on an annual basis, there's a good record of history. So to talk a little bit about the data itself, we're still analyzing it and we're still going through this, but just to highlight one of the metrics that we were able to pull out. This is a table of the top 10 publishers by publication count. And our data set is based on 2017 data. So this is publication activity that happened by faculty at the University of Colorado Boulder in 2017. And I think what's interesting about this chart is that, you know, we see some of our major commercial publishers at the top. We see Elsevier, we see Springer. I pulled out Springer versus Nature in this specific chart. But we also see that there is representation from some of the scholarly societies that are also rising to the top of this top 10 publishers. So the American Geophysical Union, the American Chemical Society, and the American Physical Society. And while we don't have data on the specific numbers of publications within this chart, one interesting thing is that, you know, Elsevier, Springer, Wiley, their portfolio of journals is quite large, and it might comprise more journals than someone like the American Geophysical Union. So there are more opportunities to potentially publish in an Elsevier journal than maybe in an AGU journal. But because there's such a high level of activity and publications coming out of these societies, one area that we could explore further is that it potentially suggests a high degree of engagement that faculty have with the societies that are for their disciplines. Another area that we analyzed here is just the number of contributors from faculty contributors from CU per article. And so, we see on average 1 to 1.5, 1.6 range of authors per article. So it's not just that there was one article published, it was that a little over one faculty were contributing to that publication. And then to think about this from a little bit of a different standpoint, looking at the data set itself and considering who is represented in that data set, we looked at a comparison between the various categories job categories within the faculty classification. So when we talk about faculty at CU Boulder, it's not just tenure track. So there are 4 different job categories within the faculty rank. So there are tenure track range, there's instructors and senior instructors, there are lecturers, and then there are research faculty. So the differences between these are instructor, so tenure and tenure track is probably what many people think is traditional faculty, where there's the opportunity for promotion into a tenured position. Instructor positions, those are at-will positions, but they're on renewable contracts that are between 3 to 4 years with the opportunity for promotion into that senior instructor line. Lecturers are what might be thought of at other universities as adjunct faculty. These are 1-year renewable contracts. And then research faculty are similar to instructor and senior instructor lines, where they are at will 3 to 4 year contracts that are renewable, but they're focused on doing research versus the instructor lines, which are more focused on teaching. And what's interesting is that not every job category is required to complete this annual review process. So only the tenure track and the instructor lines are required to go through the annual review process, whereas it's optional for lecturers and research faculty to complete the data. So that does skew what is represented in the data itself. As you can see for publications, there's a large amount from tenure track faculty, and other job categories do have some research represented. But what's interesting, I think, is also in this more of the service components for the editorial and peer review, where at least within the evaluation process within the libraries, service is not the criteria for being evaluated on service is not different between a tenure track librarian and an instructor track librarian. So there may be some interesting things going on with how faculty are represented in editorial and in peer review roles between the job categories.
So with our data set that comprises literally thousands of records, what does this all mean? And how can this type of analysis really help to benefit both the institution and the researcher? So, well, we're really looking at this critical analysis of activity and engagement, as Jalea showed you in our previous slide, to really see whether or not does this data actually align with institutional values? And what we mean by that is, if we say that we're publishing in certain areas, or if our institution supports certain disciplines, is that really where the activity is taking place? There's certainly other ways to look at that, but that was one of the questions that we're trying to interrogate. And also, really, are there any potential inequities in our current state of values? So is there a mismatch between what we're actually doing and what we're saying? And I think that analysis of data of this particular sample actually help us to try to interrogate that particular question. But we really do also want to identify areas where we can allocate additional resources and support. Here, we're not suggesting that we take these numbers and then just decide based on that, how we allocate resources. But if there's a lot of activity that's taking place and comparatively little institutional support for a given area, that is something that an institution would want to look at. But within the course of libraries and how this type of data might be helpful, we think that it would be incredibly helpful for libraries to be able to know really who's publishing, who are engaged on editorial boards, and really have that not just inform collection development, but also really have that as a source of interaction and engagement with the library and these individuals and researchers who are working to create these outputs. And I think that is something that is critically important for institutions who are making difficult decisions about whether or not to step away from big deals, whether or not they want to renegotiate large contracts. And so that particular type of relationship has shown to be really important at the University of California. And I know that there are other institutions who are using this type of collaboration data to be able to have a better picture of what they should do on behalf of their institutions. The other thing is that in identifying these editorial board members, it's really an opportunity not just to engage during negotiations, but certainly that is something critical and of interest to libraries, but also in building these connections for better engagement and support throughout the institution. But when we collect data samples, large ones like this, there are questions really about data in the collection itself. Data privacy, data ownership, data control. Jalea mentioned to you that the system that's used at the University of Colorado Boulder largely is homegrown, but there's also a vendor component to that system. And so it's really important to really ask the question about who owns this data, because that's something that's certainly of interest to faculty, and they would like to know these things. And it's been an issue that's come up in things like Academic Senate. There's been a number of white papers that have been written about this particular topic, including at the University of California. And so this is something that we know is on the minds of researchers. When it comes to usage and application of this data, I alluded earlier to the fact that with these systems and with this much data collected, it really should be taken as part of a whole rather as just completely dictating the process of how policies are defined or how resources are allocated. So particularly with a third-party system where this data is collected and controlled by a commercial vendor, we think it's really important that there be policies in place prior to data collection, and that usage of this data is specifically spelled out so that these uses will be known to not only the individuals whose data is being collected, but also they'll know how this data is being used and what is considered appropriate or inappropriate. And so here we wanted to address really this opportunity that we have in our talk today to talk about not just the research process that we went through and our forthcoming research article, but also about what we learned through this process in the research study. So there are some practical and actionable steps that we think you can take. And really a lot of this is about building relationships and collaboration with other units. So for example, with this particular research study, this is a collaboration between UCLA Library and University Libraries at Boulder. But we also engage with a lot of units, both locally starting with our IRB review board, but also with our Office of Data Analytics at Boulder and the Faculty Affairs Office as well. So there's a lot of units that we engage with through the course of our study. There were some interviews and meetings that we had with them. And Julia, if you wanted to say anything about that.
Yeah, we've had some ongoing meetings and conversations and had the opportunity to share some of our preliminary findings to both that Office of Data Analytics, who manages the system itself, as well as Faculty Affairs that maybe has more of the policy overview of the process, and talked about the things that we found that are more, that won't necessarily make it into the article. So it's some nitty-gritty things about like, here are the things that are being measured and whether or not, you know, that as we've discussed, whether or not that really aligns with the values that the university is sharing out there and that Faculty Affairs wants for its faculty to engage in. And so having those types of conversations with the people who are able to actually, you know, change the system and how it collects information or change the policies on what is being collected, I think really speaks to research going beyond just an article that communicates findings. And so I think that for both of us, that's something that's really resonated with this project in particular.
And just to provide a concrete example, one of the things that we alluded to earlier was about lecturers not having to fill out this form, but we wanted to emphasize to Faculty Affairs that there may well be benefit for those individuals who'd like to use this tool to document their activities so as to try to further advance their academic careers, for instance. So those types of uses, how the systems can be used to actually help the individuals that are using the system is something that we think is really important. So we really want to encourage sharing motivations and talking about ways that both the library and the university at large can work together in these types of environments.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Julia. We are at time. So, oh, okay, that's your last email. Great. Slide, I mean. Next, we have Tatiana and Camille. And everybody who's attending, please do go ahead and drop your questions in the chat. Chase is keeping track of them.
So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today. We're going to talk about our study, Black, Indigenous, and People of Color Faculty Perceptions of Open Access, our approach to our study, as well as issues that came up due to COVID-19. So first, I want to introduce ourselves. My name is Tatiana Bryant. I am the librarian for DH, History and African American Studies at the University of California, Irvine, excuse me. I'm the principal investigator of this project. And I'm also an OpenCon Berlin scholar. So I'll leave it to Camille to introduce herself now.
Yes, so I'm Camille Thomas. I'm the scholarly communications librarian at Florida State University. And yeah, so Tatiana and I met at OpenCon 2017, I believe, and just kind of had a conversation about the lack of information in this area, or like specific examination of BIPOC faculty's perceptions or challenges or experiences that they have. And so we were able to work together with the support of this grant to make that kind of study happen and fill in that gap. Yeah, so some of our research questions are, so what are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color faculty's level of awareness of open access? A lot of more general studies kind of start with awareness, so we started there. And we also wanted to see if there was any differences or similarities in how awareness is spread among BIPOC faculty compared to general studies of faculty. What are their motivations for publishing open access if they have? What experiences, whether they're positive or negative, have they had with open access? And what is their institutional and disciplinary support, like maybe financially or in terms of culture, a culture of support around open access? What does that look like?
So our research design was meant to last about a year or so. In spring 2020, we started with recruitment. So we sent out a pre-screening survey on listservs and throughout social media to ask people to be a part of our study. That was, I think, a fairly successful recruitment. We planned initially to do our data collection over the summer of 2020. We were successful in that. We had 36 interviewees across 8 different 90-minute focus groups. During this semester now, fall 2020, we have our transcripts, and we're starting soon our coding and our analysis, and comparing our concepts and emerging themes with literature as well. And in spring 2020, we plan on disseminating our findings at ACRL 2021 during a presentation and publishing our research article in CRL. So these were our initial plans. And just to note that we, due to the pandemic, due to COVID-19, we had to institute a rolling recruitment strategy. So we had our survey open from spring through July. We had to transition from in-person focus groups as initially planned to Zoom. Just to note, we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. Thanks, Kamal. And we'll talk about that more, our transition to our remote qualitative study, and changing our methods up in a couple of the next slides. So I also want to note that we're both at different institutions, and navigating a research study of this kind requires cooperation and a lot of back and forth between our IRBs. So we did go through IRB for our study, and it's always a challenge doing it across institutions. I do have a chapter that recently came out on how to navigate multi-institutional IRB processes, as well as like the type of collaboration that's required across research teams. And this chapter is available in UC Irvine's institutional repository. And you can also find the book through ACRL Press that it's a part of in Reflections on Practitioner Research, which was just published. So I want to talk a bit about our transition to remote study work. Initially, we had planned expenses around travel, space, food, as well as incentives, software, and research assistance help. Because of our move to Zoom focus groups rather than in-person focus groups, we were able to cancel a lot of our expenses around travel, around essentially renting space that is off-campus space, which is a requirement of most IRBs if you do studies, as well as purchasing food for focus group attendees. We were able to cancel those expenses and reconstitute them for higher incentives, for more powerful software analysis tools rather than that we didn't have access to before, as well as to hire research assistant to help us with transcriptions and some logistics management, as well as funding for translation. So part of kind of the ethos of doing this open access work is making sure our research is available in languages other than English, in a language other than English. And so that was our emphasis behind that. We are I'm also in transition, navigating to a new institution. So part of that requires going through the IRB process again, and all that's entailed with moving a grant to a new institution and transferring those funds.
So when things were still in person, we did an initial pilot at the Open Education Conference, the 2019 conference. And it was very helpful. It informed our questions as we were developing the questions for the IRB approval. And we realized that we had to be really clear about our scope. There was a lot of confusion around OER versus open access research. So just by virtue of being at an open ed conference, we got a lot of people who were conflating them or using them interchangeably, which of course there's certainly overlap. But I think it kind of helped us decide where we were going to recruit once we got past the pilot stage, and how we phrased the questions as well. Because it was very hard for us to get to some of the research questions that we wanted to ask about when people were talking about things in the context of like open textbooks. And so that was really helpful. When it was in person, we found that like the room mattered, where it was located. We ended up kind of like doing a lot of snowball in-person recruiting. And we needed a note taker as well. We wanted to make sure the note taker was also BIPOC faculty, so that it was kind of a safe space, which it could have worked with another note taker, but we were really conscious of fostering a place where the participants could feel that they could be candid about their experiences. And so all of that changed once things went remote.
So yeah, pre-COVID, we had planned to attend conferences designed for affinity groups in higher education, as well as open access related conferences. We sought to reach all different regions in the US. And we started to schedule in-person focus groups at two focus groups at one conference in particular. We scheduled travel, registration, all of that. We also scattered spaces in different parts of the country where we're located locally, and then where we planned on doing interviews. But pretty much about a month or so before we were set to travel for our first in-person focus group, we had to transition to remote. So we had to go through an IRB modification, which was fairly simple, but we had to modify our IRB to note that we were now doing focus groups online. We still planned on doing multiple rounds, and we still planned on having a really diverse sample as far as the regions we were pulling from. We initially thought time commitment would be less of an issue, but it's really hard to recruit people during the COVID-19. It's really hard to recruit faculty during the summer months, whether we're before the pandemic or even after the pandemic. That's usually a time where faculty, take vacation, decompress, plan for their next semester. They might leave the country, any number of things. And in order to increase participation, we had to really increase the amount of our incentives. So initially we were offering $20. We had to increase that to $100 per participant in order to get people who signed up to actually kind of commit to attending. So it was very difficult to, it was harder to recruit, and it was much harder to get people to commit once they'd been recruited without those increased incentives. And it's to be expected. Even people who had participated in focus groups, it was hard to get them to even claim their gift cards because of everything that's going on right now in our world. So overall, we recruited a lot more faculty in humanities and in social sciences than in STEM. And a couple of takeaways is we learned to do our focus groups immediately after contact and send calendar invitations, send reminders, etc., to really hopefully reach people and get them to commit to a focus group. And we'll talk more about that in a bit.
Yes, I would also add that we realized that because we were looking to get perceptions from such a specific group, that it was also hard recruiting because there's just less BIPOC faculty compared to like if you were, doing a general kind of study of BIPOC faculty, and they may also have additional demands, whether that's professionally or personally. And so we realized that may have contributed to, in addition to just, everything being completely changed by COVID.
So currently we've paused our data collection. We've completed our first round of data collection. We've paused our analysis of that. But prior to pausing it, we identified a number of areas for support and outreach for BIPOC faculty, and we identified motivations, challenges, and awareness of open access amongst BIPOC faculty. We were also able to hire a research assistant to transcribe, which I think is important for the values that we're trying to embed in this particular study versus using some of the vendors that are out there. As far as tech issues, we had some issues with Zoom, but we were able to do a lot of this analysis, do a lot of this data collection remotely, and keep track of what we were doing to help with our coding, which is our goal for this fall. We were also able to use the grant to purchase in vivo software, which is a bit more high-powered and great for the kind of analysis we're trying to do. But we're on pause currently while we transition my IRB over to UCI, as necessitated by the research office.
Yes, I'll also say some of the emerging themes that we did see from just kind of preliminary analysis was that, and it was interesting because we did have so many social science and humanities faculty that a lot of their entry point was through digital humanities, which I think is kind of a at least from my perspective, like a new development. And I think something that digital humanities was seeking to do. So it's interesting. It was interesting to hear that. There were also really interesting feedback about like open access fund support and concerns about like predatory publishing. And there are a lot of systemic issues as well in academia and academic publishing that there needs to be further discussion about like the open access publishing's role in that, because a lot of them were more systemic, the things that they were bringing up.
So I mentioned that the vast majority of our participants came from humanities and social sciences. We had a handful of people from STEM, largely nursing and public health, but we're eager to speak with more STEM faculty. And we were able to secure another grant to do a second round of data collection, which will focus solely on STEM faculty, and we'll do another round of focus groups this winter. As far as dissemination, we are presenting the goals for our project and a call for participation for BIPOC STEM faculty at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's Roundtable on aligning incentives for open science this November. And then we're also presenting the findings from our first round of data collection at ACRL 2021 and writing about that in a College and Research Libraries article that should come out in 2021 as well. Our goals for our articles in this area on this topic are to translate them at least into Spanish, and we have additional funding now, so we'll be able to do them in French and Portuguese as well. We're also planning to publish a data paper and deposit our data sets, and then produce a couple of educational materials for LIS practitioners, and then eventually publish on our second round of data collection on STEM faculty. And we're planning that second round now and our recruitment strategy for that.
Yes. So just to wrap up, because I know we want to get some questions in. So we are continuing to recruit STEM faculty specifically, and we were able to acquire additional funding from Lumina through connecting with some open funders, Lumina being one of them. And so we're really excited to continue and fill in some of these gaps in the research about OA.
And we're really grateful to ACRL RESEC for allowing us to really develop this study and push it out further than we could do without that funding.
Oh, we're so glad to be able to fund you all this year. I think there were a few questions in the chat, Chase.
Yeah, and just a reminder to everyone, if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and make sure you have your settings to for the questions to go to all panelists and attendees so everyone can kind of see. But we did have one question come in, and this is for Jennifer and Julia for the second presentation. Can you expand a bit on how you were able to retrieve the data on faculty at University of Colorado? And is this publicly accessible data, or did you have to request permission to access it?
Sure, we can definitely address that question. So the data itself that's collected, some of the data is marked as public and some of the data is in fact limited to the institution. However, we were in early conversations with the Office of Data Analytics, who is the steward of the data at the University of Colorado, to determine whether or not we would be able to access this data. For the publicly marked data, that was the data really that we were requesting. We still had to go through the IRB process and receive the exemption so that we could receive the data, but after we went through that process, we were able to get that institutional data. I should mention that there was other data that we also requested from the University of Colorado that related to subscription data, and part of the intended uses for this grant funding was in fact for us to be able to complete these records request filings so that we could receive the data. Anything you want to add? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not publicly available in the format that we received it, but much of the data feeds into the faculty profiling system. I think there's a Vivo, there's a Vivo instance where faculty can provide their publications and CVs and some of the service activity. I think the service activity is a little bit more limited on Vivo of what's available. So our data set was basically formatted from the raw files and provided to us by the faculty information system.
Great, thank you. And then we had a question from Elise about what's the chapter, and I can paste that into the chat box from Camille.
Oh, I think someone did already, actually. It says, when two homes are better than one, collaborating on cross-institutional research by Russell and Brian. Is that the one?
That one. Yep, that's it.
Yeah. Oh, okay. You did that, sorry. We are at the hour. I think we had an hour scheduled for this. So I think that's it. Thank you so much to our panelists and our attendees. Happy Open Access Week again. And also I want to say, even if you don't receive a research grant because ACRL budgetary COVID constraints, but outside of that, the research agenda is really intended for everyone to enable scholarly communication research that's grounded in questions around diversity, equity, inclusion. So I really do encourage you all to take a look at it and maybe apply to your own institutions. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.